Hello, class. Professor Calderon here. This is week 12. So now we're looking at a Soviet film under Stalin. And I'm looking at page 389 in our textbook. At the end of the 1920s, Soviet film employed a well-deserved worldwide reputation. But within a short time frame, the influence of the great dictators was lost. The golden age was brief, and the great directors was lost. The coming of sound made the famous Russian montage outdated and therefore was a factor in decline. From 1928 to 1932, the Soviet Union experienced a massive transformation touching on all aspects of life. The changes introduced in the cultural sphere were part and parcel of wider changes that included forcibly collectivizing the countryside, liquidating the kulaks, and attempting to build an industrial civilization in the shortest time possible. Artists were cajoled and coerced to come up with the principles and methods that would be suitable in this new order. So they're looking for the artists to sort of define what's suitable in this new world order. Stalinist leadership was dissatisfied. The Bolsheviks considered film to be an excellent instrument for bringing their message to the people, and they aimed to use it. So they're going to exploit the power of film, the Bolsheviks. The Cultural Revolution aimed to remedy what seemed a fault to the Bolsheviks' leaders. The most interesting and experimental works of art, from an artistic point of view, remain inaccessible to simple people. So there was this sort of classism going on in the art, where the simple people didn't have access to it. The peasants and the workers. The Bolsheviks' policies brought about some of the desired results. And in the course of the 1930s, film going for the first time became part of life of the average citizen. In the 1920s, cinema was basically an urban entertainment, but the bulk of the people lived in villages. So how do you bring these people out of the villages? That was the problem, and into the city centers where these theaters were. Socialist realism derived in part from 19th century realism. Its transparent style was considered an appropriate vessel for topical themes concerning socialism and Soviet development. Its tenets held that artists should infuse works of precise ideological formations, such as so-called party spirit. The idea that the party's leadership in social affairs should be affirmed at all times. So they're looking for this party leadership's affirmation in the work of the artists and the filmmakers during this time. Moving on, socialist realist novels and films followed a master plot. Okay? The hero, under tutelage of a positive character, a party leader with well-developed communist class consciousness, overcomes obstacles, unmasks the villain, a person with unreasoned hatred for a decent socialist society, and in the process himself acquires super consciousness, that is, and he becomes a better person. So this idea of socialism making you a better person is infiltrated into the fabric of film in Soviet film. Between 1934 and 1940, Soviet studios made 308 films. Of these, 54 were made for children. Historical spectacle became especially frequent in the second half of the decade, as the regime paid particular attention to rekindling patriotism by old-fashioned appeals to glory. So they were making films about national heroes. A reoccurring theme in films dealing with contemporary life was the struggle against saboteurs and traitors. This was an age of denunciation, phony trials, and uncovering unbelievable plots. In 1940, a curious phenomenon occurred. Of the 30 films in that year with contemporary subjects, not one focused on traitors. The internal enemy disappeared, and his place was taken by foreigners and their agents. The country was preparing to face a foreign foe, and instead of ferreting out the presumed internal enemy, Films now preached how the nation's makeup, the Soviet Union, must work together for the common good. Although the 1930s, the films depicted outside world as undifferentiated, threatening, and uniformly miserable. So they were portraying, they wanted the common people to believe that anything outside of the construct of socialism was going to generally make you have a miserable life. In this world, people were starving to death. Brutal police were represented. In the world, people were starving to death. Brutal police were repressing the communist movement, and the ultimate concern of workers was the defense of the Soviet Union, the workers' fatherland. From the late 1930s until his death in 1953, Stalin became the supreme censor. He personally saw and approved every film released. And just like the Goebbels in Nazi Germany, he micromanaged the cinema, suggesting changes to titles. He supported favorite directors and actors, and he reviewed scripts. Moving on to the Great Patriotic War, on the bottom of page 393. The wartime Soviet cinema presents an irony in every country's cinema, and it became more and more controlled by state, and it became more propagandistic. In the Soviet Union, too, cinema was mobilized for the war efforts, and the films produced were obviously propaganda films. In 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and German troops advanced rapidly towards Moscow. The leaders of Soviet film industries dealt with a difficult situation to the best of their abilities and mobilized the industry with astonishing speed. They devoted most of their scarce resource to making documentaries and prevailing on leading directors to take task of editing newsreels. Necessity became the mother of invention, since it was impossible to make a feature film without escaping the control of government. The studios quickly made an adjustment. They started making short films and they compiled them into collections. Anti-Nazi shorts were put into production straight away, and the first collections appeared in cinemas on August 2nd, 1941, with 2 or more the following later that month. People craved movies. They wanted to be taken away from their everyday miseries. They wanted hope. They wanted their faith in ultimate victory to be confirmed. Film-going was one of the few remaining forms of entertainment. Between 1942 and 1945, Soviet studios turned out 70 films, and of which 21 were historical dramas. Films dealing with the experience of soldiers at the front were surprisingly few, with the far exception of Georgy Vasily's Front, 1943. Mostly undistinguished, as long as the fighting continues, there was little desire to romanticize it. Okay, they were like, they're not. The fighting was brutal, you guys. The Nazis invading Russia. It was not nice. It was an extremely brutal war. So they did not want to romanticize it. Instead of depicting the war as a series of heroic exploits, filmmakers preferred to show the barbaric behavior of Germans and the quiet heroism of the loyalty of ordinary, simple people in extraordinary circumstances. The turn from Marxist intellectualism to old-fashioned patriotism began before the outbreak of war, with a spate of films about the national heroes in the late 1930s. But during the hostilities, the process accelerated and films were regularly made to show how a single great individual, Stalin, right, could influence history. I'm going to the last years of Stalin. The end of the war did not lead to more freedom for filmmakers. On the contrary, you would think that the end of the war would lift this censorship, this drive to hold down a certain type of story. But the contrary happened. The Stalinist leadership took steps to reestablish ideological control that had been loosened during the war. The capricious demands of authorities and their constant intervention in filmmaking became so oppressive that the film industry ground to a halt. During the worst years of the period, often referred to as the time of film hunger, Soviet studios produced fewer than 10 films a year. That's nothing. 10 films a year. And some of the films made, such as Einstein's Ivan the Horrible, Part 2, they were not shown until after Stalin's death. During these desperate years, the cinema suffered more than ever from the bureaucratic interference, one-dimensional political messages, the suppression of individual style, and the primacy of the word over the image. The changes in 1952 to 1953 did not immediately affect film production. In the Soviet Union, it took a considerable amount of time to see film projects through from its conception to its release, and the films that came out in 1953 were as dreary as before. Okay, I'm going to stop this one right there. I'll see you on the next video where we talk about Indian cinema.